Atheists today often define faith as believing in something for which there is no evidence. Mark Twain said, "Faith is believing what you know ain't so." Some internet atheists even define faith as believing in something which does not exist. Richard Dawkins says faith is a kind of mental illness. He calls faith one of the world's great evils. Dawkins said, "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence." Now, what is really funny about Dawkins' definition is that there is no evidence to back it up. Alistair McGrath tells a story in his book, Dawkins' God. "When I debate these issues in public, I regularly get asked why Christians blindly trust in God in the absence of any supporting evidence. I ask if they would be kind enough to tell me where they find such a ludicrous idea and to justify it from a serious Christian writer of note. I am usually greeted with an embarrassed silence. Yet on occasion I get the answer, 'Well, that's what Richard Dawkins says.' The audience usually laughs. They get the point. Asking an atheist for a definition of faith is like asking Genghis Khan for a definition of compassion. Most atheists are clueless about faith. They have no interest in truly understanding it. But worse still, they deliberately try to misrepresent faith. Dawkins' definition of faith is a case of inventing a false meaning without any evidence to back it up that twists the meaning of faith so he can attack it as irrational. So what is faith? I'm going to give you two definitions of faith, one from the Bible and the second from a theologian called Griffith Thomas. But since definitions are not easy to get our heads around, I'm going to use an illustration of faith that will help us unpack and explain the two definitions. Imagine a little girl who interrupted her father while he was reading his weekend newspaper and drinking coffee. "Daddy," she said, "could you build me a doll's house in the back garden?" The father lowered his newspaper and smiled at her. "Yes, darling," he said. Then he picked up his paper and continued reading. Later, through the window, he saw his daughter putting a pile of clothes down on the lawn in the back garden. After a while, he saw her take some cups and saucers and add them to the pile of clothes. Then he saw her put some plates and cutlery down on the grass. He put down his paper, went and found his wife, and asked, "What's she doing?" His wife replied, "She obviously believed what you said about building the doll's house." Now keep that little story in mind as we look at the definition of faith given by the theologian W.H. Griffith Thomas. He wrote, "Faith affects the whole of man's nature. It commences with the conviction of the mind based on adequate evidence. It continues in the confidence of the heart or emotions based on conviction, and it is crowned in the consent of the will, by means of which the conviction and confidence are expressed in conduct." Griffith Thomas uses four phrases based on the letter C to define faith: conviction of the mind, confidence of the heart, consent of the will, and expressed in conduct. What do we mean by conviction? It means being sure of something, being convinced. Think of the way the little girl in the story was so convinced her father was going to build a doll's house that she started getting ready for it. Then secondly, she had confidence. Confidence means trust. She trusted her father's promise to build a doll's house. She obviously had experience of his love towards her, his ability to make things, and his way of keeping his word. Thirdly, she took action. Her faith expressed itself in conduct. She started behaving as if a doll's house would appear very soon in her back garden. The consent of the will is slightly harder to see in the story of the doll's house. Consent of the will means that she made a choice. The will is our decision-making faculty. The will is involved in choosing between alternatives. It is the basis for action. When the little girl heard her father promise to build a doll's house, she could either choose to believe her father or not. If she chose not to believe her father, she might have asked him whether he really meant it, or she might even have just gone and started watching television. Instead, she chose to believe him. The little girl demonstrated consent of the will by actively taking steps to prepare for the coming doll's house. So, as Griffith Thomas put it, faith starts with conviction of the mind, that's being sure, followed by confidence or trust of the heart. It is expressed in conduct or actions, all of which demonstrate the consent or choice of the will. The Bible's definition of faith is given in an entire chapter, Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 gives us a definition of faith in verse 1, and then it gives us case studies of Bible characters who displayed faith. Here is the definition. Faith is being sure of things hoped for and certain of things not seen. Being sure and being certain are exactly the same as Griffith Thomas's conviction of the mind. Faith is being sure of something. Faith is the opposite of doubt. But notice there are other aspects of faith that go beyond mere intellectual conviction. Being sure of things hoped for and things not seen involves an element of trust or confidence of the heart, to use Griffith Thomas's language. As we read through the rest of Hebrews chapter 11, we find people like Noah and Abraham who trusted God's promise about things coming in the future, things which they hoped for but they had not yet seen. We also read about other Bible characters who expressed their faith by their conduct and who made choices to obey God. Now notice that Griffith Thomas says that conviction of the mind is based on adequate evidence. We are convinced by evidence of some sort or other. Even a little child might believe something simply because their mother told them so. But rarely will a person believe something for no reason whatsoever. Faith has its reasons. For example, many people believe in God because it seems completely unreasonable to think that the universe just made itself, or that living beings created themselves. Other people believe that Jesus really was the Son of God because of his unique and sublime personality, and because his resurrection is the most reasonable explanation of the evidence. It is true that faith goes beyond intellectual reasoning. We could define faith as reasonable trust. Faith is based on evidence and reason, but involves an element of trust as well. But faith is not anti-intellectual. Atheists like Dawkins are peddling a false and twisted definition by saying that faith is belief in something without evidence. Faith is not a cop-out either. Faith is very common. Everybody has it. The financial system depends on confidence. The word credit comes from the Latin credo, I believe. A run on a bank occurs when people have no more faith in it. Athletes need to have self-belief to win. Anybody getting married has to have faith in their spouse too. Some non-Christians speak of faith as a mystical gift that religious people have. I wish I had your faith. As if faith was something that some people have, but not others. But the same people are quite prepared to allow doctors to operate on them, or to fly in aeroplanes, putting their confidence or faith in the ability of surgeons and pilots and the technology they use. All people have faith in many different things. Even atheists have faith. Because when anyone says, I believe this or that, they are just saying, I consider this to be true. Christopher Hitchens said that atheists such as himself do not hold any beliefs. Our belief is not a belief. Alistair McGrath responded by saying, this astonishing statement is one of the best examples of blind faith I have come across, a delusion that makes his whole approach vulnerable. The atheist definition of faith is an example of what happens when people talk about something they don't really understand. As Michael Roos, an atheist philosopher, wrote, Richard Dawkins, in The God Delusion, would fail any introductory philosophy or religion course. Proudly he criticises that whereof he knows nothing. The God Delusion makes me ashamed to be an atheist. So there you have it. why atheist attacks on faith are baseless and silly and bigoted. Hopefully, you now have a better idea of what faith is all about. If you want to explore this topic further, I encourage you to get a copy of Why There Really Is a God, which provides answers to this and other atheist objections to God, as well as laying out the evidence for God's existence.